Weekly Sceptic episode 94. I'm Nick Dixon here with Toby Young, now in Australia. And coming up, I hear we have some kind of election, which seems like a big deal, so we better talk about that. Plus, elections in France as well, with Le Pen crushing it. And will Biden survive in so many senses? Plus, of course, all the extra content for people on basedmedia.org, Peak Woke, and all those kind of shenanigans. And Toby, you've moved from New Zealand to Australia.
Yeah, I'm now on the Australian leg of my Antipodean speaking tour. And for anyone listening in Australia, I'll be speaking at the Oxford Scholar, which is a pub in Melbourne tomorrow at 5:30. And then on Wednesday, there's an event in Sydney. And then finally, there's another event in Perth. And for details about my gigs in Sydney and Perth, go to freespeechunion.au for the Australian Free Speech Union website. But yeah, no, I've been having a great time, meeting loads of people. Spent the day in Canberra today, meeting some very sound Australian politicians. But yeah, spent yesterday in the hills above Melbourne, checking out some wineries. Had a great time in Adelaide, great time in Brisbane. You wouldn't believe how buoyant the Australian economy is. I mean, this feels like a country on the up. It's booming. It's so much more affluent than the UK. I'm quite glad I didn't bring any of my kids with me on this particular tour because I don't think they'd want to go home. It just feels like the land of opportunity compared to the UK,
Wow.
particularly on the eve of, our descending into a one-party socialist dictatorship.
Why is that? Apart from the fact we're just poorer than even Mississippi, the poorest state in America. We're just dirt poor. But what's the reason that Australia's doing so well?
I guess it has lots of it. It's got abundant natural resources. Not particularly high density of population, an enormous amount of land. It's well positioned to trade with Asia and China. So yeah, it's just the economy is just booming. The GDP per capita, I think, is at least 50% higher than the GDP per capita in the UK. And you just everywhere around you can kind of smell the affluence. I mean, the cars, the restaurants. It's like being in like the whole country's like Knightsbridge.
Wow. Well, we'll have a load of people moving over there, no doubt. I've had friends talk about it for a while, but I can't because I got skin cancer in Dubai, so Australia would be the same. The reason I'm so pale is I've avoided sun for the last 8 years. It would kill me instantly going to Australia. So it's not on the cards for me, but maybe other people will move out under the Starmageddon, as Boris called it. I've got all sorts of awful things happening in my life I can't talk about, but I will say I've discovered untethered bottle caps. I've found some.
Excellent.
And we're not sponsored by them, but it is Buxton.
Uh-huh.
Drink Buxton if you want, because we're not sponsored by them. But if we were, why not consider Buxton? Because regular listeners will know I was very angry about the tethered bottle caps, which are an EU monstrosity, which certain UK companies are going with out of convenience because they don't want to change their factory settings, I guess. And it's a single-use plastic bollocks where you have to... it's so you can recycle and all this nonsense. And they've destroyed the design of the bottle top. It's kind of idiocracy in a bottle, I called it. And it's been destroying many people's lives, many people cutting themselves, many people very depressed about it. And I used to be a Highland Spring drinker, but they've gone along with the Kool-Aid. But Buxton seemed to not be. Now, maybe it's just because they're not exporting to Europe. I don't know. But I knew you'd have to go quite far north to have any kind of sanity. The bottle's it doesn't have the same integrity as the Highland Spring bottle, but the company has way more integrity, I claim, and it's got a nice contoured grip. So consider Buxton because the caps. The main thing is the caps are untethered. So to paraphrase Joey and Friends, now I can drink water every day. Remember that episode with the milk? Now I can drink milk every day. That's one for my generation.
I'm glad you've discovered an untethered bottle cap.
Yeah, and we'll do it. I know we've got an election coming up, but we will do an hour on the untethered bottle caps. And then in the bonus content, 10 minutes on the election. No, just kidding, guys. We better get to it. Very quickly, we better promote basedmedia.org for the full episode, nickdixon.net for the full episodes of the Current Thing podcast, buymeacoffee.com/nickdixon to throw me some money in these dark, non-Australian times. And Toby, do you want to quickly plug something before we get on with the show?
Yeah, join the Free Speech Union if you haven't already. freespeechunion.org/join. and check out the new Daily Sceptic podcast, The Sceptic. And if you become a donor to the Daily Sceptic, if you pay £5 a month or £50 a year, you get all these perks now. You can see our paywalled content, you can participate in our Discord forum, and you can watch the premium content in our new podcast. So, yeah, go and check it out, dailysceptic.org.
Okay, and you might see me drinking half an emergency Diet Coke as a one-off emergency because I'm so tired. I didn't sleep at all last night. People loved no, the night before I had literally zero sleep, and last night a few hours. So I know listeners loved me talking about my problems, but don't shout at me. It's half an emergency Diet Coke, but I have largely quit. All right, now all that important personal stuff is done. Let's crack on with this election. So we're recording Wednesday, so it will be going out tomorrow, election day. So, I mean, if we make any predictions, we could look very stupid. But the polls, I mean, that's their whole job, isn't it? So the polls are out there and they're saying, not Polish people, of course, they all went, but the polls are out there saying quite shocking things. These MRP polls, which some people say are kind of bollocks, but some people say are more accurate. And they're predicting all kinds of things, like this one from Politics UK tweets, a final poll by Redfield Wilton, which puts Labour on 41%, Conservatives 22%, Reform 16%. Now, where's the one? That's not the one I wanted, though. The one I wanted had the seats, with Labour getting some absurd amount. Many people are predicting like 430. I think I saw 434. You've got one where Reform has 18 seats, though, Toby.
Yeah, doing surprisingly well. And yeah, in most of these MRP eve of election polls, the Tories are just absolutely in desperate straits. So most of them sort of in one of the polls, I think that the Tories had fewer seats than the Lib Dems. So the Lib Dems became Her Majesty's opposition, and in the remainder of the Parliament, the summit of the Conservatives' ambition would be to overtake the Lib Dems as Her Majesty's opposition. Forget about winning another election. That would be a huge achievement for the next leader of the party, who I'm sure we'll get on to in a minute. Yeah, I don't think my original bet, Nick, which was that it would be a hung parliament. I don't think I'm going to win that one. But I did bet that Labour would poll a lower percentage of the vote than it did in the 2017 election. So I think I might be on course to win that one. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's see. I mean, Rishi at one point was saying there could still be a hung parliament, and that's like that's their like big claim now. That's their goal. But yeah, I saw this one from Survation, which has Labour on 484. I said 434. It's 484. Conservative on 64. Lib Dem 61. So Conservatives just scraping the opposition in that, and Reform gets 7 in that. But bizarrely, the SNP get 10 in that. Can you believe they get 10? And the Greens get 3. And it's mad. It's mad that anyone votes Green, by the way. So while we're speaking about polls, did you see this poll that puts Reform UK way ahead with men and young people? So a new JLP. This is JLP's poll. Reform in second place with 16 to 17-year-olds, joint first with males. So all 16 and 17-year-olds. Labour gets 39%, but Reform gets 23%. Greens 18, Lib Dem 9, Conservatives 5. Completely wiped out among 16, 17-year-olds. Labour wants to lower the vote to 16, but if they do, they'll be competing with Reform instead, because this is presumably the TikTok effect of Nigel Farage, aka the TikTok man. Someone said, "Mummy, is that the TikTok man?" In a piece about him. So, and males, Reform 35%, Labour 35%, tied, as the Americans say. Lib Dems 11%, Con 11, Green 2. But then at females, Labour 43%, Green 33%, Reform 12%, Lib Dems 8%, Conservatives 0. And because of that, and we know why. And I said we need to solve the problem of women being socially conditioned to vote for parties that will actively put them in danger. And yes, I meant immigration, you could argue, but I also meant, the trans issue. Why are you voting Green and Lib. This thing has happened where it's just become socially acceptable to vote for these parties. I was speaking to a very no-nonsense Polish woman the other day, and she'd voted. She can't vote in this one, but she voted Green in the Europeans. I was just amazed. I was just like, why do you vote Green? But it's become socially acceptable to be a massive lefty and to not really realize, these people are screaming Allah Akbar when they win. I mean, that's fine if you're on board with that, but just so you know, that's what they do now. But they're voting sort of in this kind of, to me, this is what Peterson talks about, the high agreeableness. I could be wrong, but I think they're just, it's become socially acceptable to vote and unacceptable to vote for these right wing parties, whereas men and young men particularly are just not asked about that, and they're saying, no, we love Nigel. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I thought that was an extraordinary finding in this JL Partners poll. It was published in The Sun, wasn't it? And it was 16, 17-year-olds. So, as you say, overall, amongst that age group, Labour are ahead and Reform in second place. But the discrepancy between men and women's preferences in that age group was really extraordinary, with Reform topping the poll for men, or at least joint top with Labour. But 35% of 16, 17-year-old men said they would vote for Reform, and 43% of women said they vote Labour in that age group, and only 12% Reform. So it's really clear that there is a kind of huge discrepancy in the political preferences of 16 and 17-year-olds. But yeah, it does give some hope in that if Labour does lower the voting age to 16, presumably in the hope of hoovering up all these young voters, it might turn out that actually it benefits Reform more than it does the Labour Party.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff. I mean, Alison Pearson, our friend Alison, in this Telegraph piece, spoke about the potential shy Tory wives for Nigel, a previously unknown voting bloc. And it's quite funny because all these wives going, oh, he's quite dapper, isn't he? Don't say handsome, say I said dapper. So, that's a possible voting bloc. But I just think silent Reform voters is a new voting bloc. My theory is that it's not just, I've just made this theory up, it's not just a protest vote anymore. It's just that they've immediately switched to Reform instead of Tories in their minds, many people. And now they're just a shy Reform vote. So they're not necessarily even going to say it, though in that poll, obviously, young men are saying it and men. But my theory is just, it's not even necessarily just a protest vote. We've just already moved on to Reform. But then, like the Tories, we're not everyone's going to go on about it. And so it might be even higher than the polls. What do you think to that?
Yeah, it's possible. I think that...
Completely made up.
I think that I don't think the Tories are going to do as badly as these most recent MRP polls predict. There's been a slight narrowing of the polls nationally in the last couple of days. Reform, it looks like, are being pegged back a bit. I mean, we could discuss whether that's because Nigel's made a couple of mistakes, such as saying Putin was provoked, or whether it's just because there does seem to be a concerted effort by the mainstream media to pile on to Reform. But nevertheless, I don't think Reform is going to do as well as it was predicted to do, 10 days ago. I think I'll be amazed if Reform, wins more than 5 seats. I think it'll probably win fewer. I also think the Tories, I can't imagine they'll win fewer than 100 seats. I think they'll win about 140. And I think they'll be way ahead of the Lib Dems. So I don't think they need worry about not being the official opposition. But, Labour will still have a huge majority.
Yeah, and those are the two main choices you can go for. The scorched earth 484 plus seats, or the one you're saying, which is the more moderate. Yeah, I mean, I really don't know. I don't think I'm going to make a prediction because I don't know. I'm too tired, and I could see it going either way. Do you want to quickly get onto that Reform thing then, since you mentioned it, which is, have Reform been attacked? And particularly the volunteer who filmed by Channel 4, film saying some racist stuff about Rishi Sunak. And then Farage, of course, claimed he was an actor. And it turned out he was an actor, at least on the side. And whether he was acting in this, and the claim was, he actually I've watched videos of him where he speaks in a sort of normalish, sort of lower middle class sort of tone. And then he comes on this thing, he's speaking like a Cockney. Farage said he was speaking like that from the moment he was on set. So he seems to have been, it appears from that, if you believe Farage, that he was in character the whole time. The thing that's really suspicious to me about it, that makes me think it is dodgy, is the focus from the media, the way it's being talked about, the kind of Jussie Smollett vibes. No one's saying, let's cancel this guy. He shouldn't get acting work. What's his job? It's disgusting what he said. It's almost like he's coming out and going, no, I am a big racist, guys. And no one says, why is the focus not on him at all? When someone says things like this, you go, oh, this is a terrible person. The focus is entirely on reform and getting Farage and in sort of playing down this guy. It's very strange, almost like they're admitting it. It's a very strange dynamic because he's coming out. They're sort of saying, yeah, look, he said these racist things. No, he is real. The whole media push is like, no, this guy's terrible and reform are terrible. But if it was a real event, the focus would be on this guy as well, saying horrible things, which is sort of not really even part of the story. What do you think to that?
I don't think the conspiracy theory stacks up. It won't surprise you to learn. Had he been an actor pretending to be somebody else, then maybe it would have made sense. But he isn't pretending to be anyone other than Andrew Parker, the actor. So in what way does he benefit from this? I mean, he's never going to get any more acting work now. Why would he torch his own career just to try and discredit, reform? I mean, Nigel said, when Nigel's kind of asked that question, he says, well, maybe he thinks it's going to lead to some work, but it's not going to lead to any work, is it? If you're kind of caught on film calling Rishi Sunak the P word, you're never going to work again as an actor. I mean, look what's happened to Lawrence Fox, and this is like times 10 what Lawrence Fox said on Question Time, and he hasn't worked since. So I don't see why. It's just not credible to me that this guy would agree to a masquerade with this independent production company for Channel 4 and sacrifice his career just to kind of put a dent in, a momentary dent in for a reform support. It just doesn't stack up.
Well, it does stack up because if he was doing it to damage reform, he wouldn't lose his career because the people in the know would know that he was on board with them, and he'd get other kind of, you see these kind of disaster actors during COVID, they keep getting roles like that. He'd get other kind of roles like that. Maybe for a while he'd have to die down, maybe he'd have to do them in foreign countries, but he would get other roles. Or he's getting on a bit, he's not a successful actor like Lawrence Fox. Maybe the payout was sufficient to just say, yeah, I'll just do this. Okay, it's one big job, and then I'm out and go back to my property development, which I think was his main job. So why not do that? I mean,
I think the other. I just. I
don't want to get in legal trouble speculating about what he was.
I don't think he's going to be. He's going to kind of tell people in the know are going to know that he was just doing this to discredit reform. He's not really a racist, and therefore will give him work because, unless he has plastic surgery and changes his name, they can't give him work. He's the racist guy now.
He can do disaster work in Japan, crisis acting in Japan. That's my third album.
I also don't think that the independent production company or Channel 4 would risk it because they'd be completely discredited. Everyone's heads would have to roll as soon as it was found out. And it's not as if they have to search very hard for these slightly nutty, unsavory reform supporters. I mean, there's one under every rock in Clacton, seemingly. But
why was it initially denied he was an actor? If it's so easy to find these people, and why did they initially deny he was an actor? That's apparently what happened. Anyway, how about this then? A more modest sort of version of it is that he was sort of entrapped into it and ensnared. I mean, there's a Steve Edgerton piece on this I haven't read because I'm actually paywalled out of GB and I haven't asked anyone to unpaywall it, so I can't read GB's paywalled articles. But that piece seemed to be suggesting that there was many people who they tried to get to say things and the other candidates didn't. So in this version, it doesn't matter if he's an actor or not, but he was at least enticed by journalists to say, the most dodgy things possible. What about that?
I think my impression is that he was certainly kind of hamming it up a bit, but seemingly because he was just enjoying kind of getting into a role. He was enjoying being part of the kind of circus of the reform elect Nigel Farage campaign in Clacton. Maybe he lives nearby. So he was kind of, so it does seem like he's acting because he's doing his so-called rough voice and he's kind of saying these things. It's as though he's getting into character when he's saying these things. But I think he's just the kind of guy he is. Some actors are like that. He's just kind of enjoying being part of the scene and entertaining people, and is goaded into kind of going further because, it's all a bit of a laugh for him.
Why did he show up with his rough speaking voice from day one, and why is he speaking in that voice? You can hear him on his reel talking in a different voice. Why is he speaking in an act? If he's not an actor doing a role, why is he showing up in a different voice? That's pretty weird, isn't it?
Well, it's just actors are pretty odd like that. I mean, he probably thought, this is the kind of guy I should be if I'm going to help. If I'm going to help Reform's campaign, I'll kind of people will be able to relate to me more easily if I'm kind of toning my accent down a bit and kind of hamming it up and sounding a bit more Cockney.
So you're admitting he's acting, but you think he's acting sort of unilaterally to help Reform rather than in an acting role.
I think he's just he's just hamming it up.
And you think that's the more normal, plausible Toby version? I mean, that's a weirder version, if you ask me.
Maybe I know more actors than you.
Well, I've tried to stay away from them. So, okay. Well, they also had some other candidates. I mean, there was the one that said he would slaughter migrants. That was not ideal. Locker room talk. Then there was I find that I get in such trouble. There was a clip, we didn't want it being shared, and then they shared it anyway on GB, and then I was in trouble for it, and Leo was in more trouble. We weren't in that much trouble, but people were sharing it, and I just, we were laughing at it because it's a comedy show, but I just found it so funny how extreme and insane the things the guy was saying was, so I just called it locker room talk, like Trump. But I personally thought that was funny. That was the guy that was calling migrants scum and the pandemic was mass murder. There was this other guy who was really hard done by, I thought, called James Gunn, who said promiscuity isn't attractive. They tried to ask him, some young lady asked him about Andrew Tate. He says, he's not my role model. I don't know much about him. But then they asked about promiscuity. He said, I think girls should be aware promiscuity is not attractive to young men or even old men, he said as a sort of self-deprecating joke. They've been taught by feminism that men and women can behave in the same way, and I'm sorry, but it ain't true. And that seems perfectly fair to me. And he just seemed like an eccentric, slightly posh guy with an interesting hat to me. So that guy was hard done by. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think most of these guys who've kind of been exposed, quote unquote, by the media should, lose their livelihoods, should be, excommunicated, ushered out of public life forever. But I do think it speaks of a kind of lack of seriousness on Reform's part. I mean, Nigel blames the private company he hired to vet the candidates, but that feels like a pretty weak excuse. The fact is, it suggests that they haven't done the necessary kind of preparatory work to, I mean, maybe they were in one sense wrong-footed by Rishi Sunak, so they had to go with, candidates at the last minute and try and pull together, because they always said they wanted to field a candidate in every constituency. They weren't going to concede any ground to the Tories. But it does, to me, speak of a lack of seriousness, that they never, they never intended to kind of actually win a large number of seats. And if they are going to take over the Conservative Party, they're going to have to get their act together and grow up a bit.
Okay. What about, I mean, I disagree, but what about the war? I mean, it's no surprise that you would take the Kemi side. So we've got this war now between Kemi and Nigel, and the Times here has Badenoch voters must see through Farage's act. And there's been more since then. And there's been a piece, again, from Alison Pearson in the Telegraph. Kemi Badenoch was very unpleasant. So Nigel says that Kemi was personally rude. I mean, I think maybe some of Kemi's people have listened to this podcast, so we don't want to offend Kemi, but I'm just going to read what was written. Farage talks about meeting Kemi. She's very unpleasant. It was a social event. Oh, yeah, he said, looking forward to talking to her, but we had a really unpleasant exchange. It was a social event, happy evening, but Kemi was really aggressive towards me. She was like, how dare you? If you come back, you're going to split the vote. You've got to realize that you're going to let us down very, very badly. I said to her, you've got no divine right to this, Kemi. The Conservatives have no God-given right to rule. That was what Charles first thought. And look what happened to him. And then reference to the civil war there and a beheading, presumably. So, and he says, no, she was adamant. She didn't even we didn't even part on a pleasant note. And I thought her attitude, well, in a way, that's very revealing, and I won't forget it in a hurry. So it's war between Kemi and Farage. I mean, this is going to be the new war on the right, reform versus the right of the Tory party. And I guess you've been very team Kemi to the point where I almost think you're some sort of paid shill, as people would sort of shout at you, because you're so pro Kemi. It's just sort of a bit dodgy. And obviously, I'm pro Farage. But what do you think about this?
Well, I do think she's the Conservative Party's best hope of recovering after this massive setback. In fact, as you know, I thought the Tory Party's best hope was to defenestrate Rishi and make her the leader and give her 6 months to introduce herself to the British public and then call a general election. And I still think that would have been a better bet than what Rishi did and what's about to happen. Yeah, it's sort of an unexpected kind of, third act twist, isn't it, in this general election campaign? This kind of acrimony between Farage and Kemi, and it does look like it might be part of the post-election hangover. If Kemi does become the leader, then it looks as though she won't admit Nigel Farage into the party. And it also seems to be emerging as a schism between Kemi and Suella. Suella has been quite complimentary about Farage, and she said, she thinks he should be admitted into the Conservative Party if he wins his seat in Clacton. And she wrote this op-ed in the Telegraph today, which we were talking about before we came on air, in which she said that she thought it was wrong to attack reform because it's got some slightly dodgy candidates, because after all, Frank Hester funded the Conservative Party and he said some equally dodgy things, so there's equal culpability there. Yeah, I wonder if that'll be a kind of an issue in the forthcoming Conservative leadership campaign. Will each of the leaders in turn be asked whether they would admit Nigel into the party? I don't think there's actually any realistic chance of Nigel being a candidate in that election. I don't think he's going to become the leader, in this particular round. But if he's readmitted and the next leader doesn't win the next general election, then he might be in pole position to take over.
Well, so I've got two things, and I think I'll get to Suella after, but I'll have to address this Kemi stuff. So, what did you think of the Kemi David Tennant episode? So, it's a little while ago now when we record, but David Tennant was saying all this absurd stuff. He a speech, one of these pointless actor awards, and he said that he didn't want people like Kemi to exist. And then he said, I wish no ill of her. I just wanted to shut up. And it was sort of horrific. And that was awful. But then Kemi came back with a very strange reply about Tennant being a rich white male, and how, the optics of him attacking her as the only black woman in government. And I hated this, because now the generous interpretation is that she's using the left's rhetoric against them. But I didn't really see much evidence of that. She didn't say, well, according to your own logic, you shouldn't be doing this and things like that. She just sort of said it, as far as I could tell. Let me see. She said, I will not shut up. I will not be silenced by men who prioritize applause from Stonewall over the safety of women and girls. A rich, lefty, white male celebrity, so blinded by ideology, he can't see the optics of attacking the only black woman in government by calling publicly for my existence to end. And it goes on. That's the first of two. But to me, there's nothing in there to suggest that she's just using the left's ideology against them and sort of rhetoric against them. It looks like to me she's just saying that. So I could never vote for someone like that, because they're using my immutable characteristics as an automatic pejorative, which just has to stop. I mean, the Tories just, if you're in the Conservative Party, you should just not be doing that kind of thing at all, as far as I'm concerned. So I could never vote personally for someone like that. But what do you say to that?
Well, I don't think I think you're reading a little too much into it. I don't think she was criticizing him because he's a white man. I think she was saying, as someone who identifies as a progressive and on the side of the goodies, why haven't you thought about the optics of attacking, the only black woman in the cabinet as a white man? I mean, to me, it did sound as though she was saying, it just seems like a a really odd thing for someone who identifies as, an LGBT ally and a member of the woke left to be attacking the only black woman in cabinet. To me, it didn't sound like she was playing the race card herself or accepting the logic of identity politics. It felt to me like it was just saying, how come the optics of this haven't struck you, given that you identify as a progressive LGBT ally and upstanding member of the woke left?
Okay, well, if she does come out and clarify that at some point, or if that becomes clear from her future pronouncements, then I'll reconsider, because, there's a slight ambiguity there. But it should have been clearer when you're just banding around terms like white men, because to me, it looks as though, if you look at the Tories' record with Cameron's insistence on we were all white men, so I did something about it. That was one of the headlines, I think, in the Times, that Cameron come out with stuff like that. He had his A-list, all his diversity bollocks. To me, Reform UK are the only party that isn't actively anti-white men, which is quite a shocking state of affairs. But I think that's probably true. It's certainly true that Labour and the Lib Dems and the Greens are, and there's certainly an argument that the One Nation side of the Tories are, and even some of the other side. And then Reform, the only time they've done it is one candidate put out this ludicrous campaign ad boasting about the number of non-white candidates they had, and you're like, look, here's an Asian, here's a black person. It was kind of embarrassing and ultra cringe. But I have it on good authority that was just one rogue person, and that's not the policy of Reform. And their policy is get rid of DEI and go back to meritocracy. So therefore, if you're a white man, I don't see how you could really vote for anyone else. I mean, I'm not trying to make it's up to people who they want to vote for, of course. Yeah. But if you were looking at that issue solely,
I think you may be doing Reform and Nigel Farage a slight disservice there, suggesting that they are almost a kind of white ethno-nationalist party. Maybe
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying they're a non-DEI meritocratic party
that's
is
true.
The only one that doesn't openly discriminate against white men. It's a very different claim.
Okay, that's true. But they don't. They seem to be attracting lots of brown and black men as well. Particularly among 16 to 17-year-olds. I mean, in that respect, Farage is a bit like Trump. He doesn't just appeal to kind of disenfranchised working class white men. His appeal's much broader than that. But I agree. They are certainly the least identitarian of the main political parties. I think the SDP probably falls into the same bracket.
Okay, SDP as well. But that was my point. I mean, you can't just change my point and straw man it. Zia Yusuf's one of their main backers, isn't he? So, and he's a Muslim. So, no, it's not about that they're an ethno-nationalist party. It's that they want to go back to a 90s style meritocracy, and they're the only ones that don't actively discriminate against white men. There's a huge difference, and it should be huge. I mean, no white man and no probably white person, full stop, should vote for any of the other parties because they openly. It should be insane to even consider it, because they openly discriminate against white men in a way that they would be shut down completely if it was any other group. They would not be able to be on the telly. They wouldn't have careers. They wouldn't be allowed. The police would investigate them, because Cameron with his thing of just deliberately promoting people because they're not white men. All that is extremely ideological. It's extremely woke. We pretend like it's normal now because we're so used to it, but it's not normal. What's not normal from my upbringing is what Reform do, is saying we want it to be a meritocracy. And Ben Habib talks about having one white parent, one Pakistani, and it would be foolish. He talked about this on my podcast. The current thing, it would be foolish for him to take one view or the other. But therefore, it's obvious to him that you need a meritocracy, and so that's what they want. But I don't hear any other party saying that. All the other parties, including Cameron's Tories, assume that white men need to be brought down.
I know it's
just how far they need to be brought down. Maybe they might disagree on.
I agree. It's sort of indicative of where we've got to as a society, that the only party in this election seemingly subscribing to Martin Luther King's doctrine of not judging people by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, are, in virtue of saying that, considered far right and beyond the pale. Yeah,
and that's the insanity of where we are. That's the Overton window. So you're unsurprisingly pro Kemi on this thing. Anyway, so and J.K. Rowling waded in as well. And because apparently Tennant also went on and called feminists little whinging bleeps on the wrong side of history behind the scenes. So he carried on his tirade
Rant.
behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of disgusting garbage, but it's not that surprising. That though it is notable that even amongst actors, he stands out as a bad person, which is quite an achievement.
That is quite an
Sorry to
achievement,
all
yeah.
actors. I mean, it's just been an actor attacking episode this week. So I have reasons, but so and just quickly to get back to that Suella thing before we forget, she put out this article today. The Tories are in no position to attack Farage, as you say, completely bizarre piece to put out. I mean, on the eve of the election, such a strange piece. I mean, it's really a "I'm moving to reform" piece. Surely, I mean, it's the kind of thing Starmer would write. It says that they took money from Frank Hester, so they can't get on their high horse about race. They shouldn't lash out. She says, today the grandees who remember bear no responsibility for the fate of the party they've led lash out at Nigel Farage and reform. I don't agree with Mr. Farage and everything, but we Tories need to reflect honestly and with humility to ask ourselves how a startup party with very little infrastructure has galvanised the electorate and lured so many of our lifelong supporters. Well, that's true. But it's an extraordinary piece to write if you are a Tory, because, it does still say, hey, we need to vote Conservative, but it calls them out for hypocrisy and sort of says we need to listen to people voting for reform. What do you think, Toby?
Yeah, odd. And she's clearly positioning herself as part of the pro-Nigel faction on the Tory right, and maybe this is a way of trying to isolate Kemi on the Tory right. I don't know, but there seems to be something weird going on there.
Yeah, and we haven't really talked about Starmer, so let's have a quick look at some Starmer news. So Boris, here was a headline in the Mail: Britain can still swerve Starmageddon. And it was one of Boris's own columns with his typical sort of Boris-esque language. There was a funny bit about vapor, which I need to find. He used he basically is saying how Starmer's a radical, he's dangerous, and he talks about the more you dig into Starmerism, the more left-wing and dangerous it turns out to be. Very much the sort of Hitchens take on that, and I tend to believe that's also true. It's not just that he lacks Starmer lacks Blair's charisma, he lacks the broad appeal of Blair's policies. Starmer's hatred of private enterprise rises off him like a vapor. So that's quite a good one. So actively resentful that he's preparing to attack private education and force many schools to close. I mean, yeah, that is going to be horrific. And he also says he would make this country the punk of Brussels. And then there was he sort of did a speech as well, didn't he? There's pictures of Boris surrounded by people doing some speech somewhere last minute, coming out and trying to rally the troops. In a way, quite strangely, because he was knifed by Sunak. But what do you make to Boris's intervention, if you want to call it that?
Yeah, well, I guess he had to do something if he's going to sort of keep his hand in and keep his chances alive. He couldn't just kind of sit out the general election campaign entirely. My read of it is that when the parties get to know how the postal votes are splitting a few days before the actual general election. Now, they're not supposed to tell anyone. It's supposed to be, a secret, and it's a criminal offence to pass on any information. But inevitably, political parties being what they are, that information leaks out. And my take is that Boris discovered that the Tories actually weren't going to do as badly as they'd been predicted to do. So he thought, I know, I'll make a last-minute intervention, and then I can claim some of the credit for kind of saving the Tories from a total wipeout. So that's my read.
Well, you know Boris quite well, and that does sound the kind of thing Boris would do. And on Starmer in general, I mean, there was this big story, it's not that big, but there was this thing that he said he would always go home at 6 p.m. I would always go home at 6 p.m. on a Friday. It's called Sticking Plaster Weekend. He said he'd go home. He always says Sticking Plaster Politics, doesn't he? He said he always would go home at 6 p.m. on a Friday, no matter what. I mean, about to launch nuclear war at 6:01. He's like, I'm sorry, a rule's a rule. You can see Starmer doing that. It's just as he claimed that he wouldn't go private, even if his family member was dying. It's just very Starmer. He's very rigid, dangerously rigid mindset of the ideologue. What do you think?
What was funny about that is that when he was attacked by Rishi and others for being, proposing to be a part-time PM, because how can you possibly expect to do the job given how demanding it is and go home at 6 p.m. on a Friday? The defense quickly became, that's anti-Semitic. The reason he wants to go home at 6 p.m. on a Friday is because his wife is Jewish and evidently they celebrate Shabbat. So to say that it's lazy, it's shirking, the responsibilities of a prime minister to clock off at 6 p.m. on a Friday is anti-Semitic. But Starmer himself never said that was his reason for wanting to go home. He said it was because they'd set aside family time, his wife and his, 2 sons, on Friday nights, and they spend that time together. He didn't mention Shabbat. I mean, you can imagine why he wouldn't, given that they're already struggling to retain the Muslim vote in some constituencies. But it's slightly odd that became suddenly kind of the Tories being anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I mean, that is funny, isn't it? Everything, once you say something like that now, you can't be criticised. It's a great defence. But as you say, it's not the best defence for certain aspects of his party, who would probably be like, oh, yeah, he probably does do that. That's why he loves Israel. Yeah, that's grimly funny. But as you say, he seemed to just say it was all about being a family man. Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit weird. Starmer is weird, though. He's a weirdo. I mean, I watched his interview with Gary Neville because, I really took one for the team there. I used to obviously I like Neville as a player, being a United fan, and I do like some of his commentary, but then I forced myself to watch him with Keir Starmer. They were in my neck of the woods, the Lakes. I was thinking, get out of the Lakes. But I just wanted to get more of his mindset. But he's very much about, everything's worth, he's ruthless if necessary to achieve his ends. He does have the mindset of the greatest ideologues in history, like the great tyrants like Stalin. He has the mindset of a means to an end, which is okay if you're, I guess, purging the party of anti-Semitic cranks. But if you're, I don't know, he's got the worrying, rigid, ends justify the means mindset of history's greatest monsters. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. History's greatest monsters. I don't suppose it'll turn out to be history's greatest anything, including a monster. By the way, did you see there was quite a funny exchange between Roy Keane and Gary Neville, in which Roy was complaining that whenever he sees Gary Neville, whenever they make an arrangement to have coffee, Gary's always on his phone. He's always checking his phone. He's always late. Sometimes he doesn't turn up at all. He usually leaves early. And Roy was sort of saying, you've got to make time for your friends in life. What's the point of earning all this money if you don't make time for your friends and family? And other people around the table, were agreeing with Roy. That is what Gary Neville is like. So it was no surprise, but it was devastating, I thought, for Neville. It just sounds like.
Did you recognise any of those characteristics in yourself? Okay.
No.
Workaholic, always doing other work. You're not like just before our live shows doing other work on your laptop with headphones in, so I can't even talk to you. It's not.
I'm just busy running these the Free Speech Union and the Daily Sceptic, and fighting for justice. But on the subject of mercenary former footballers, did you see that Gary Lineker got into a spot of difficulty because he's paid by Next to promote a kind of their products, and he wore one of their products whilst hosting the Euro.
It was that green top. This was last week, though, but go on.
I don't think we discussed it though, and it turns out he's always kind of virtue signaling about how much he cares about the poor and the dispossessed, the migrants, and turns out that those jackets are created in Bangladesh by people earning 44p an hour. It's like, and Gary, meanwhile, is paid millions to promote them.
And what's quite interesting there is Starmer was in trouble for saying we should send people back to Bangladesh. So maybe he wants to send them back to work on Lineker's clothes, and it comes full circle.
What was the context of Starmer saying that?
It was something about. I think it was just a question, wasn't it, on some forum about how he was going to deal with immigration. I don't know what. I can't remember what it was now. Was it the Beth Rigby one? No, it was a different one, I think. but he just said that it's about. I think to me it was about how Rwanda wouldn't work, but what would work was sending people back to their actual countries of origin.
Right.
That's what I took from it.
Okay.
But then Rishi on the debate, which we haven't talked about either, the BBC, wasn't it BBC? The head-to-head debate said that was actually Rishi's best moment in the entire campaign, which isn't saying that much, when he said, where are you actually going to send people back? What, you're going to negotiate with Iran? You're going to send them back to Afghanistan? You're going to negotiate with the Taliban? It's ridiculous. How's it going to work? And he really hammered him and was actually wound up. And it was the most sort of borderline angry and passionate I'd seen Rishi. And actually, it was his best moment. And he thought, actually, we need to see more of that Rishi, when he's actually going, because that is his strength. He's someone who you feel is working in the background on logistics and is much smarter than the average politician, according to Dominic Cummings. And you think, okay, him going, no, but how's it actually going to work? You've got no idea. And it's actually beating Starmer at his own game, which is, I'm sensible. I actually know how things are going to work. They're just saying things. But Rishi goes, no, you're going to negotiate with the Taliban. What are you talking about? What is your actual plan? And actually, that was the strongest moment from Rishi. But I wonder why he's been so wet in general, because that was, he had to get genuinely angry to really, for us to see something from him.
Yeah. It's like he's definitely been better. I mean, I've been watching it from afar, but my impression is, and I didn't watch the question time debate thing, but my impression is he's definitely improved. He's brought out his A game finally in the last week of the campaign, but too little, too late.
Yeah, too little, too late. And I'm very worried about the future of Labour. I mean, I speak to people all the time who, it surprises me how many people have been affected by wokeness. I was speaking to someone the other night who I thought was just a sort of normie, nice guy, but not, politicized in any way. And if he was, he would be part of the sort of Remainer blob people who I know around where I live. But actually, he had a workplace thing, and obviously won't say too much about it, but if someone had been sacked for breaching woke speech codes, he had tried to stand up for them, and then he had faced a sort of disciplinary black mark, and then the person he complained to had taken 4 weeks off, feeling unsafe, even though it was her job to deal with such conflicts. And they were all in the office, just disciples of Robin DiAngelo, who just thought her book was just the gospel and couldn't be criticized. And he said, yeah, but, I've read some other books for like a different take, and this blew their mind. These people always say, educate yourself. They mean read the one book that we adhere to, that's absolute bollocks. And they actually said to him the line, context doesn't matter, which is such an incredible line, but it is the belief of the race ideologues. So, and it was a racial thing that happened. It was just so shocking. And you think to yourself, but then when I mentioned this getting worse under Labour, he didn't really make the connection. And that's what I worry about, that so many people around the country, more than I even think, and you'll obviously know this with the Free Speech Union, are being affected by the tyranny of woke speech codes, and of course the utter lack of productivity therein as well. But do people make the connection and realize, oh, no, look at the New Britain document from Gordon Brown. This stuff is going to get so much worse under Labour. The stealth wokeness of Labour, the sort of everyday tyranny in the workplace, that's what we're going to get under Starmer. Do you agree?
I do. I mean, we sit here joking about it, but I think we're going to enter, I think, a dark period in our country's history. I remember during the Brown era, when he was finally kind of prized out of Downing Street. There was that kind of awful period of uncertainty after the 2010 general election, when it wasn't clear whether Brown was actually going to cling on. And at some point, it looked like he was refusing to go and would form a minority government because the Tories hadn't won an overall majority and they hadn't yet worked out their coalition agreement. And it looked as though he might be able to work out a coalition agreement with the Lib Dems. And, Nick Clegg was flirting with both of them. But there was I remember when he finally went, and when there was that kind of moment when Clegg and Cameron announced they'd reached an agreement in the Rose Garden of Downing Street, there was this sort of sense of an extraordinary weight being lifted from your shoulders. It was as though the sun was finally breaking out. I mean, of course, it turned out not to be much of a new dawn. But I think I worry that it's just going to be like that again. There's going to be this terrible cloud is going to descend, and that'll be, the Starmer premiership. And I'm sure in workplaces across the country, the kind of woke scolds are going to be empowered by this victory. They'll be more and more convinced that they're on the right side of history. Complaints will go in. HR, EDI officers will feel empowered and be much more tyrannical. It's going to be, it's going to be a lot of business, I think, for the Free Speech Union over the next 5 years. Let's hope it is just 5 years.
Yeah, I feel very much the same way. Of course, I'm being attacked on various fronts in the culture war, which I can't really go into, but it's very bleak for me. And also, I was listening to Andrew Tate talking to Katie Hopkins, whatever you think to them, they were talking about all the things they've been through. Then I was kind of piecing it together in my head with this thing I just heard about this guy's workplace. Now, I don't know. I was getting very bleak about it as well, just thinking how miserable well, the culture war already is miserable. And then you've got Starmer. Yes, it could all be very bad. What else can you say, really?
The story you tell sounds uncannily familiar. I remember about in the early days of the Free Speech Union, we were contacted by quite a senior executive at one of the big kind of consultancy firms. And it was during the height of the kind of BLM imbroglio. And the chief executive of this big consultancy said, he trotted out the normal cliches. It's past time. We had a grown-up conversation about race. For too long, we've been sweeping it under the carpet. We need to confront our own shortcomings. We need to have an open discussion. And so I recommend you read the following books. And it was the reading list from hell. It was Robin DiAngelo. It was Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. It was all the usual books you'd expect to be, ex-Kendi. And this guy, I think he took the email from the chief exec in good faith, and he said, "Yes, I agree. Let's have an open conversation about race. But all the books you've recommended are all just one point of view. That's critical race theory. Let's also read some other books about the same subject, which look at it from another point of view. So what about Douglas Murray's latest book? What about a book by Shelby Steele? What about this book by Thomas Sowell? What about this essay by Coleman Hughes?" And he was immediately suspended and placed under investigation and eventually had to leave the company.
Wow, exactly. There you go. These people, it's so disturbing. And actually, there was a moment like that for me in Dale, which was pretty disturbing, when David Curtin on his show, on Dale's show, said that the ideal family unit is a man and a woman, which is not a controversial view. Then he did also say he doesn't believe in gay adoption, but that's not that controversial either, or shouldn't be. It's one view. These views were normal until 10 seconds ago, and Dale was like, if you carry on, I'll cut your microphone," and later called him an unpleasant bigot on X. So you go, hang on. So as someone who wanted to run for the Tories, you is so disgusted by the idea that the man and woman might be the ideal family unit that you can't even say that. It just it just reminded me, because we're in these times where the other views are shut down, and you feel that's very much what Labour will try and do. I mean, just another quick run through the other Labour stories I saw. Labour will make every UK borough take fair share of migrants, says Angela Rayner. So you're going to have migrant socialism where they'll be distributed throughout the country evenly. So look forward to that. Labour's net zero target could cost hundreds of billions, leaked audio reveals. This is Darren Jones, Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. He was saying that, yeah, of course, that 28 billion was a tiny amount. And he said that it's going to be much bigger, even than the scrapped. When an audience member said some people would say that 28 billion a year was not enough to decarbonise the economy, Mr. Jones replied, "No, it's tiny. Hundreds of billions of pounds we need. So get ready for hundreds of billions spent on net zero that they're not telling you about in the manifesto." Then there's this stuff with the press. Labour wants endorsement from the Sun after getting backing of Murdoch's Sunday Times. That was in the Eye. Will they get the Sun's endorsement? I don't know what the update on that has been. BBC to love bomb Labour if it wins election. So whether they'll just work in conjunction with the BBC or whether there'll actually be antagonism is another question, or whether they just, BBC need a license fee to survive, whether we'll just have a Labour state broadcaster. Andrew Marr plays it down and says it'll be hostile soon enough, like it always is. But I don't know. We could have just a woke, state media controlled, stealth woke, ridiculous net zero tyranny coming up.
I'll give you my menu of horrors. So new national curriculum. So Labour are going to rewrite the national curriculum They're going to task woke academics with rewriting it. They're going to decolonize it as if it's not decolonized enough already. And they're going to insert even more critical race theory and gender identity ideology. And not only that, they're going to force every school, every taxpayer-funded school in England to teach it. So at the moment, academies and free schools, which make up the majority of taxpayer-funded schools, state schools, don't have to teach the national curriculum. Labour are going to insist that they do teach it once they've rewritten it to turn it into a kind of why you should vote Labour woke manifesto. Schools will become woke madrasas under Labour. No wonder they want to give the vote to 16, 17-year-olds. In addition, they're going to pass a gender conversion therapy ban. So, parents won't be able to have good faith conversations with their gender confused children about why they shouldn't embark on irreversible medical pathways. They're going to pass a hate crime public order England and Wales Act, which will be identical, if not slightly worse, than the public order, the hate crime public order Scotland Act. I think they're probably going to bring in some kind of version of what Leveson recommended. So newspapers and magazines will have to sign up to the state-approved regulator or face all kinds of grim penalties. The Keir Starmer will probably criminalise Islamophobia in some sneaky way to placate the kind of the Muslim voters. So yeah, that's just the tip of the iceberg.
I can even see podcasts having to have the other side on at all times, like Ofcom. Once the online safety bill, Ofcom regulates everything through the online safety bill. I could see podcasts having to always represent the other side, the left, just like we do on GB News. What do you think of that prediction?
We'll have to join forces with Owen Jones. He'll have to put
Yeah,
him
and the only one
between
that will
us.
get around it. Honestly, I think I could see this happening because someone quoted this to me when I was talking to like insurers, and they said, "Well, we can only really insure you if you give the other side." And I thought that's a strange thing to have to do, but maybe for insurance, yes. But then I suddenly thought, what if Starmer brings that in for everything under the online safety bill? And it didn't seem implausible to me. I mean, Alistair Campbell will get around it by having Rory Stewart there, even though he's said he's going to vote Lib Dems or Green. But that'll be the only podcast that's allowed. Look, it's clearly balanced. Whereas all other podcasts will be like, no, you have to give pushback and give the other side. I honestly think, as absurd as that sounds, I could see that happening.
Yeah, I think
they will. Too ridiculous?
No, I think they could easily start to regulate podcasts. Maybe under the online safety bill. Maybe they'll task Impress, the new state-approved press regulator, with regulating podcasts. We'll have to sign up to be regulated by Impress, or we won't be allowed to promote ourselves on social media.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Oh well, the nightmare cometh.
So this is an ad from, you guessed it, Thor. Hey you, yes you, my fellow skeptic. Are you suffering one of these 9 problems? Feeling stagnant, stuck in your current role, at a career crossroads, lacking self-confidence for career or business progression, presentation skills and confidence lacking, conflicting with key board members, business development outreach ideas lacking, low professional or personal motivation, need to transition into a new role and make an impact, and finally, financial pressures in your business. Why face any of those problems alone? As Steve Jobs said, great things are never done by one person, they're done by a team of people. I've solved all of the above problems in a 2-person team with clients. So if you've got a problem, get in touch. You can contact me, Thor, on WhatsApp at +44 7906 321593. That's +44 7906 321 593. Or at linkedin.com/in/Thorholt. Cheers. P.S. If you're a fellow business owner, why not email the guys at thedailyskeptic@gmail.com and join me in sponsoring this podcast? Wait a minute, that's the wrong email address, Thor. I think if they want to advertise on this podcast, they should get in touch at theweeklyskeptic@gmail.com. And if you don't know what you'd write, message me because I can help with that problem too, the lacking copy that works problem, including for podcast advertising. So WhatsApp me, Thor, on +44 7906 321 593, or contact me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/Thorholt.
Now we better crack on and do the French election very briefly. We actually have hardly any time left. We've got to somehow do French election, Trump, Biden, and Pete Woke. So I don't know how we're going to do that. So let's just very quickly do the French one because we spent so long on the general election in our country, which makes sense. So we had this headline in the Telegraph: Le Pen, I've wiped out Macron, and I believe National Rally, Le Pen's party, got 34.5%. The very lefty New Popular Front got 28.5%, and Macron's party got 22.5%. And it was another humiliating snap election misjudgment, unless you believe the theory that Macron just wants to get out of it all, and then it wasn't a misjudgment, and it was very smart. What do you think, Toby?
Yeah, no, it does seem to have been a miscalculation on the same scale as Rishi Sunak's snap election. It's funny, isn't it, that they both made exactly the same error at exactly the same time. But actually, it looks like things that the French will be better off than us as a result of this catastrophic error. It still remains to be seen whether...
All right, that is the end of the free podcast for this week. But don't worry, there's still loads more podcasts. If you go to basedmedia.org and sign up for just £5 a month, that's the price of a pint in London or a posh coffee with loads of soy that you don't need. So basedmedia.org for the whole podcast, and you get Peak Woke, Base Department, all these great sections, and you help us keep going, pay all our staff, keep the lights on, keep this brilliant production going at basedmedia.org, and it's just £5. Thank you very much for the support, and we'll see you there.